Chapter 32, Interlude. Book 3, Undecided, Elsewhere, Chapter 12. Interlude, March 1998. Severus is surprised to find himself alive the next morning when he wakes in the manner of his youth, abruptly and completely in an unfamiliar location, without any memory of the precise chain of events that led him here, save only a faint sense of shame. Without moving, he immediately takes stock of the situation, noting that his body is not injured, but his magic is critically exhausted, that he is lying sideways on a hard metal bench, and that there are bars running perpendicularly against his field of vision, suggesting that perhaps he has been jailed. Azkaban, or a muggle cell. His muscles ache from exhaustion, but he does not feel any of the sharp pain that he would expect had he, as he had a few times before, imbibed too much and challenged someone to a physical contest of strength. But of course, he is no longer 20. His crimes would be far more serious than a drunken bout at the pub. With a quiet grunt, Severus swings himself to sit upright on the bench. He pays for his haste with the unpleasant onset of a heavy, throbbing headache that begins behind his ears and spreads mercilessly to afflict his eyes and temples. However, Severus is practiced at the art of removing his awareness from physical pain, and so with only minimal effort, he turns his attention back toward the mystery of his location. Slowly, his body provides him an additional clue. There is magic around him, old magic, magic that his body unfortunately recognizes. In the cell opposite, he sees Narcissa Malfoy, looking undeniably lovely, though tired and gaunt. She smiles thinly at him when she notices his attention. Azkaban, then, though Severus is surprised not to feel the all-encompassing misery and despair that he remembers from the conclusion of the First War, when Albus had allowed him pointedly to languish in Azkaban for over a week before rescuing him with his testimony. In retrospect, perhaps Severus should have taken better heed of that warning. "Good morning, Severus," says Narcissa politely, though not without a heavy dose of irony. Severus has known Narcissa almost his entire adult life, and he can tell at a glance that she is not frightened of her current position, which only adds to the oddity of the situation. The last thing that Severus remembers clearly is the Dark Lord dying at last, and the sharp pain of relief, followed by Tom, Potter, and Percy disappearing behind the sharp curtain of Tom's magic. Only minutes later the pain had set in, an awful, consuming pain, pain unlike any torture Severus had felt before. It had burned so hotly through his body that he'd suspected dizzily that he may be ensconced in flames, though the greater anguish had been the feeling of his magic separating itself laboriously from his body, as if someone were pulling away his skin by force and leaving him to be a bloodied mass of muscle instead, as if someone were violating the most intimate part of him, removing his power for their own will. "The Dark Lord is dead, in case you were wondering," Narcissa interrupts him. She is sitting on her metal bench as well, but infinitely more gracefully than he, her legs crossed and her back straight, as if she were expecting a visitor for tea. "My darling niece was quick to organize the capture of all of the Death Eaters, many of whom proved to be suspiciously easy to subdue, given they were all crippled simultaneously by their dear lord." Severus does not give her the pleasure of seeing him grimace, though he does indulge in a raised eyebrow. "I suppose I didn't receive an invite to your marking," he drawls. "Please accept my belated congratulations." Lucius. Where was Lucius? Almost the instant he casts his mind back for an answer, he receives one, in the form of an unpleasantly vivid memory separating itself from the thick castle walls of his mental protections and falling with a heavy thud to the ground. Lucius, dead on the floor, his blood dripping slowly onto the stones, the sudden silence shocking after an eternity of Lucius' hoarse, desperate screams. Severus had been grateful that Percy had been allowed to leave before witnessing this depravity, even as he wondered whether Voldemort had intentionally prevented Percy from witnessing Lucius' death. Certainly, Voldemort had shielded Percy from several of his more unsavory acts. Severus thinks back to the last Samhain and is once again relieved that Percy had been quietly brewing instead. Severus cannot fully mask a shudder as he turns back to Narcissa. It had been to Severus' benefit that Lucius had been so undeniably desperate. The Dark Lord had tired of torturing him more quickly than Severus would have expected, and he dismissed everything Lucius had revealed. including that Severus and Percy had known about the Elder Wand, as ravings of a man at the brink of madness. Severus had suspected for quite some time now that the Dark Lord had lost his renowned ability for powerful legilimency. There had been a time when even thinking a dangerous thought in his proximity would be enough to have a man killed, and certainly Severus had cautioned Percy to guard his thoughts thusly. That mental battle with the Potter boy in the ministry may have caused irreparable damage. "Severus," says Narcissa. Severus blinks and stiffens back into awareness. His mind feels loose and untethered, focusing on minutiae and speculation rather than the important considerations at hand. Azkaban, the Dark Lord, Percy. "My apologies, Narcissa." He apologies as smoothly as he can. "My mind was elsewhere. You were saying." Andromeda Tonks had sent Narcissa a letter telling her to stay put, not cause any trouble, and wait patiently for her release. She had told her sister once that she would not spend a single night in Azkaban, and Severus would not put it past Andromeda to keep her word, even if Narcissa would not remember that promise. Given that Severus had received no such letter, he takes that to mean that either Andromeda is not convinced he should be freed, is not capable of producing satisfactory evidence, or is leaving the task to Percy, who, now that Severus thinks about it, is likely a cell over. Despite having overseen the boy's marking, not to mention guarded him through numerous encounters with the Dark Lord, Severus has a difficult time thinking of Percy Weasley as a Death Eater, and often lumps him in his head with the Order. Percy is so frustratingly honorable, so arrogantly convinced in his own noble missions, that to equate him with any of the supercilious, seedy Death Eaters that are his peers seems incorrect. "The Weasley boy, is he here?" Severus asks with studied casualness. Without confirmation that Percy defeated Tom, Severus has to assume otherwise. Narcissa frowns and shakes her head. "No," she says, her gaze flicking down the row of cells. Severus is still feeling too weary to stand and take a look himself, so he takes her at his word. "I've not heard he is here. Andy didn't say anything about him." The day passes without either of them receiving answers. After they tire of each other's company, it had always been Lucius that had bound them, and with his death and Severus' silent complicity in it, that weak tie soon snaps. They both sit in silence, averting their eyes when they accidentally make contact. Severus can only see 2 or 3 cells down on either side, and they are all standard players. Avery not, Travers, Yaxley, so he says nothing aside from murmuring a curt greeting. Severus spends most of the day repairing his mental shields and attempting to encourage his magical core to strengthen. As the hours pass, he begins to feel a deep unease build in his lower stomach. He had seen the Potter boy die, and he had seen him come back to life and kill the Dark Lord. He'd seen Tom strike Potter and watched helplessly as Percy crawled after them. Presumably, Potter is still alive. Severus would have heard otherwise. They all would have, if the boy who lived had finally died. Surely Potter's continued life implies the same for Percy. If Tom had overpowered Percy, he would have killed Potter thereafter. In fact, Severus cannot think of a single scenario where Tom would allow Potter to live, which would indicate to him that Tom is dead. But had Tom been defeated at the price of Percy's life? Yet it was not like Percy to leave Severus here without word. Perhaps Percy had spent the day being hailed as a hero by his ungrateful little family. If he'd been cast as a villain, he'd be in Azkaban with the rest of them. Severus knows that despite Percy's carefully dismissive demeanor when he speaks of his family, he cares strongly for them. Even the Dark Lord, not to mention Tom, had sought to exploit that, or at the very least sought to test the limits of Percy's loyalty, who had promised to ensure Percy not spend a night in Azkaban. Certainly nobody that cared about Severus. It was not unreasonable to assume that Percy had forgotten about Severus or deprioritized him once his family welcomed him back with open arms. Something about this twists inside Severus' stomach, and he turns instinctively to hide his face from Narcissa, pretending to measure the distance between the wall and the metal cot. Severus is used to being very low on anyone's mental priority list, but for some reason he'd thought he'd be higher on Percy's. Their use for each other had always been predicated on the clear and present risk of the Dark Lord, and then later of Tom. Severus would not blame Percy for wishing to rid himself of their association. Still, it rankles, and most unforgivably, It surprises him that Percy would act in such a way. 3 days pass without any change, though on the third day he hears the news from Yaxley that he and Percy had felt Potter's heartbeat beneath their fingers and lied defiantly to the Dark Lord. Yaxley admits to the deception half proudly, half guiltily. He will need something to get him out of captivity, and this will almost certainly be sufficient. But the Dark Lord had risen from apparent death once before, and Yaxley would be stupid to trumpet his perfidy too loudly in case it happened once more. "Calm yourself, Corbin," Severus snaps, tiring of Yaxley's twitchy, half-baked defiance and the poisonous scowl it elicits from Nart. "I think it quite unlikely the Dark Lord shall rise again." "What of Weasley?" Yaxley's fidgeting stills, and he shakes his head incredulously. "He knew," the man says hoarsely. "He knew that Potter would be alive. He told me to wait, to stay silent." Severus thinks back to that eternal moment when Yaxley and Percy had huddled over Potter's body, searching for a pulse. How had Percy managed to communicate to Yaxley the need for silence in such a precarious position? A quick imperious, perhaps. Percy had become reasonably proficient with the spell after a year of controlling the minister, but the Dark Lord would have sensed a curse, even if Percy had cast it silently. Severus would have sensed it, and he had sensed nothing, the only sound his heartbeat thudding in his ears, and the quiet rustling of Percy's robes as he bent over Potter. What happened to him? Weasley, that is, not the Potter boy. Yaxley does not know, and neither do the rest of them, though they discuss Percy for much of the day and conclude that he must have been some sort of spy for the Order. Yaxley does not seem to resent Percy, which is even stranger to Severus, given that Percy and Yaxley had worked so closely together for over a year, and Percy had essentially betrayed him. Yaxley had been a high-ranking member of the inner circle, too. Severus finds it very strange that he is taking the news of Percy's deception so easily. By the end of the evening, Yaxley has decided that he'd known all along, and that he'd even helped Percy, lying to the Dark Lord on numerous occasions. This, Severus doubts, and all but planning a mutiny himself. Severus rolls his eyes and tunes them out, beginning to feel the first prickles of worry. The worry coalesces into a brick of anxiety later that afternoon when Andromeda returns for Narcissa. "There'll be the first trial tomorrow," she says, avoiding Severus' eyes. "Scrimgeour was alive, apparently. He's been sworn in as temporary minister. Your block is slated first, and you'll be going alphabetically by last name." "Will we have representation?" Nart asks indignantly. "My solicitor," Andromeda shakes her head. "Not that I know of. I'm not in charge of the proceedings, but I volunteered to pass the news on to you all." If Severus wanted to aid Nart, he'd explain that there hadn't been any representation in the first set of trials, nearly 20 years prior, so they all better ready themselves for a series of prolonged legal battles. The Wisengamot had decided once that anyone who had possessed the agency to swear loyalty to the Dark Lord possessed the agency to defend their actions to the court, and Severus cannot imagine they would have changed their mind. Andromeda leaves without speaking openly to Severus, and Severus cannot bring himself to ask her about any of their shared secrets. Plainly, Percy is dead or has forsaken Severus, and Severus does not wish to have the entire cell block privy to whichever answer he may receive. In fact, Severus does not elect for a trial, and he does not ask to attend the others. Day by day, the cell block empties, Narcissa freed up on her testimony, and Yaxley to the same. Nart returns after an unsuccessful argument that he'd been merely following orders, but Avery manages to claim he'd been planning a mutiny against the Dark Lord after his son had been brutally murdered. Bulstrode receives a sentence of only 5 years, given he'd not actually killed nor tortured anyone, only contributing money to the cause, and Rookwood somehow manages to claim Imperius yet again. This drama repeats itself in cell block after cell block, until the flow of visitors cease, and the remaining prisoners settle into some semblance of a routine. Day by day, Severus becomes convinced that the boy is dead, until nearly a month has passed without any news. He receives only a single letter from Minerva, stating tersely that unless Severus is willing to provide testimony to prove his innocence, there is nothing the rest of them can do, given that Severus intentionally acted in such a way that his motives remained unclear, even to those who knew more of the story than they perhaps ought. Severus crumples this letter in his first before he can stop himself. His first thought is a familiar, angered resignation. Albus clearly did not leave any vials of memory to protect his beleaguered spy, and his portrait must be refusing to speak. Severus cannot say it surprises him. After Percy had come to him with the story of the Elder Wand, Severus had realized quickly that Albus had not intended for Severus to survive the war. Severus had not corrected Percy during his inspired attempts to distract the Dark Lord, but Severus had always believed that Albus had wanted the Dark Lord to think that Severus had the wand. The Dark Lord would have killed Severus and believed himself invincible, moving to neutralize Potter soon after. Albus never would have been able to foresee a situation where the Dark Lord decided to attack the boy of the prophecy without even learning its full text, knowing Potter had the Elder Wand. In truth, Severus can hardly believe it himself. Although Severus muses to himself as the days pass and his cell block finally falls blissfully silent, Albus never calculated for the addition of a time traveler, let alone this particular time traveler. It surprises Severus how much it pains him to realize that Percival Weasley must be dead. Percy certainly has data to spare that would prove Severus' innocence, and given that Scrimgeour survived, Severus cannot imagine that Percy would still be under suspicion. Thus, Percy's name must be cleared, and the boy dead. Minerva's reluctance to visit Severus in person, Andromeda's guilty and shifty behavior, even the silence from Yaxley after he was freed. None of them have the courage to relate whatever happened to Percy in those taut final moments. He supposes it is no matter. Severus can use his imagination to fill in the details. To feel Tom pulling on his magic, rather than the Dark Lord, had been at first an unpleasantly alien experience. After decades of service, the Dark Lord's magic feels familiar to Severus, though still distasteful. The Dark Lord often spoke to him through the mark, or used it to summon him personally, rather than sending the lighter burn to the group of Death Eaters in advance of a larger gathering. Tom's magic had felt colder to Severus, sharper, and in a strange way more dangerous. It had taken Severus an unacceptable length of time to control the pain to such an extent that he was able to look up, albeit blurrily, and take stock of his surroundings. The great silver dome of Tom's magic had captured all of their attention. Yaxley and Rookwood had gazed at it with the same expression that Severus felt certain would have been on his face, had he not controlled his features with a forceful push. Minerva and the others had fruitlessly tried to breach it, though Severus would have told them not to try had he been capable of speech. Through the dome it had just been possible to see three figures, one jerking in the air, one crumpled on the ground, and the other dominating them both. Then a shift. The one in the air stilled, and the one on the ground pushed himself to his feet and reached out for Tom. And all three had been still for an eternity, before Tom's magic blazed angrily back up and started pulling directly on Severus' magical core. Had it been Percy or Potter that had reached for Tom, had said something so insulting that Tom had nearly lost control of his facilities? Had it been Percy or Potter to finally end the torment, whether with a killing curse or other spell? It had been Percy that died. Had he sacrificed himself for Potter, or had Tom discovered his perfidy and lashed out? How had Potter survived when Percy had not? Severus reclines on the cold metal bench, staring listlessly up at the ceiling, where an enchanted window shows the great storm gusting around the prison. Percy Weasley dead. Severus had thought it a certainty that the younger wizard be the one to survive. Both Voldemort and Tom had been fond of Percy in their own way. Severus was the one who ought to have died many times over. He'd planned to die at that. He'd been willing to die, almost ready to die, so that the war would finally be over and Severus freed from his miserable, unrelenting burden. Severus shakes his head, releasing an incredulous laugh as he thinks of those final moments with Lucius, Percy brazenly bluffing the Dark Lord with nothing more than the truth. The boy had been a reckless, impulsive idiot, but the Dark Lord had responded to his artless machinations and strange code of honor in a way that Severus had never seen before. He had captivated Tom, and Tom had been compromised by him. Severus had seen that early on, and though he had not approved, he had thought that perhaps it would protect Percy and help Percy in his task to learn of the other Horcruxes. It is strangely jarring to think of the Dark Lord being similarly. affected. Severus can think of very few seminal moments in his life. Meeting Lily, the first time he'd seen his mother lash out in anger against his father. His first day of Hogwarts, the day he'd shouted mudblood. His marking, the one night he and Lucius had been truly intimate. Lily's death, the Dark Lord's first defeat, and confronting 17-year-old Percy Weasley as he defiantly stared at Severus through a face full of tears and told him he was going to kill the Dark Lord. The ashes of the Room of Requirement floating around him, 2 Horcruxes in hand. Oh, he'd been such an idiot. Every move Percy had made with Tom had been such a clear mistake, and Severus had allowed it. Had he been too engrossed in his own tasks? Had he had too strong faith in Percy, or not placed enough value on his life? Percy Weasley did not deserve to die a silent, ignoble death at the hands of the Horcrux he'd helped create. He had come to Severus for protection, and Severus had failed him. Severus stares at the ceiling for the rest of the night, his mind unable to move from that single thought. Severus has always had complicated feelings about Albus Dumbledore, but for the past year of his life, the overwhelming feeling had been one of great frustration. Severus considers the thought and shakes his head. If he is being honest, and unfortunately, the only person he may be truly honest with is himself, so he is obliged to be honest when he must. He had felt frustrated toward Albus for many years, beginning with Potter's tenure at Hogwarts, and intensifying ever since he caught one of his more interesting students with 2 of the Dark Lord's Horcruxes, and learned that his entire world had changed. That the arrival of Percy Weasley into his life so significantly changed how Severus felt about Albus is another thing that Severus had relegated to the stack of feelings and memories only worth analyzing if the war was over, and Severus somehow had survived. Severus is a man of his word, so he spends most of his second month in Azkaban forcing himself to think through the pile of bricks his mind had created to guard these thoughts from harm. Albus had not trusted him, not at the very end, not when his trust would have been the most valuable, and Severus forces himself to realize that something had happened during those last few years for Albus to change his mind on Severus. Unfortunately, the weightlessness that Severus had imagined would float over him at the conclusion of his heavy burden remains elusive. Perhaps his body is still experiencing residual stress. By now he has received confirmation from Yaxley in a letter that the man called Tom was dead. By now he has received confirmation that the Horcruxes were destroyed and the Dark Lord no more and Lily's son alive. And yet, he feels untethered and unfocused, finding it difficult to focus on the relentless passing of days, to bend his mind toward the task of repentance. Some of his awareness remains in those burning final moments when Severus had felt his magic slip away. He'd fought it as hard as he could, but there had been a moment at the end where he'd closed his eyes and succumbed, knowing that what awaited him was death and Lily. This ought to shame him, and perhaps it does. Severus examines the emotion carefully, but he cannot feel anything other than painful revulsion at the memory. To feel his magic forsaking him, to be torn and ripped at the very core of his being. For years, he'd found Potter's survival to be the driving force behind his motivations. How could he not, when he dreamt more often of Lily's almond-shaped eyes than of anything else? Recently, something of the force behind that memory seems to have dissipated. The guilt remains, smoldering in his stomach with a familiar ache, but not the urgency, the desperate willingness to sacrifice his life so willingly for Potter. Potter survived, so Severus cautiously posits that his changed attitude is merely a delayed sense of relief that his promise to Lily was fulfilled. As the days pass, and he mourns the wizard he'd come to know as closely as any other wizard, save perhaps Lucius or Albus, Severus understands something about himself that makes him take pause. The revelations of the last few years. The opportunity to see in Percy Weasley's head how exactly the war ended, to see precisely where the mistakes were made. Somehow, the desire to atone for his multitude of sins by winning the war right had taken precedence over his loyalty to Lily. "She'd understand, I think," says Percy, his eyes distant, the grass crumpled under his robes. Expensive robes at that. Severus had noticed when the boy had started upgrading the caliber of his belongings after being named the Prowett heir. He'd never understood the urge himself, But then again, he didn't think even expensive robes would suit him as they suited Percival Weasley. It was one of life's cruel tricks that this boy would be born to the Weasley family, as full of poverty and blind, stubborn loyalty as they were. Percy wears the trappings of luxury far more elegantly than many pureblood heirs Severus had known. Severus tenses, though he does not let it show. They had not been talking about Lily, but the reference is unmistakable. One thing he cannot get used to with Percy is how much the boy knows about him, and how casually he sometimes reveals it. That the entire world heard the story of how Severus Snape failed to love Lily Evans. He is glad that his other self had not been alive to witness the humiliation. Understand what, precisely? Severus snaps out when it becomes apparent Percy is not going to continue without prompting. Percy starts, as if he'd forgotten that he'd said anything at all. Perhaps he had not meant to say it out loud. That after the war you should just rest, Percy says quietly, and Severus nods to himself. They had not been speaking of Lily, but rather of how Percy was afraid that, if he were to survive this war, he would not make very much of himself after all. Not compared to Tom, is the constant undertone behind Percy's insecurity. Severus wonders if he should be flattered or insulted that Percy thinks that, were Severus to survive, he would have little ambition for anything other than leisure. A stunning insight, considering you were barely just born when she died. Severus cannot help the bitterness in his voice. Sometimes he envies Weasley, the chance to return to his youth and right his wrongs with such ease, such determination, such foresight. Percy does not rise to the bait. Though Severus can rile him when he likes, the boy has learned a semblance of self-control in the last few years. Sometimes, Severus looks at him and can see the man that he truly is, peeking out from behind his youthful exterior. It boggles the mind, sometimes, that Percy in years lived is barely younger than he. True, he says with a half-shrug, but you loved her, so she must have been good, and she cared for you, so she would want you to be happy. Severus' expression sours so quickly that he cannot hide it. Something about the way that Percy said that so casually, you loved her, so she must have been good, rankles him. I enjoy many things that are not good, he says, and it is almost a snarl, the way he curls his tongue around the word enjoy. Weasley, to his surprise, flushes and looks down. He grabs a bunch of grass and buries his long fingers in it, seemingly unconcerned with the dirt creeping beneath his fingernails. But you love very little, he says quietly. To rest. It is an interesting point. Severus does not know what that means. He had never thought he would remain alive after the Dark Lord. Certainly, he and Albus had planned for his death. What would Percy have done if he had survived? Severus does not have the wild, ambitious urge to prove himself like Percy, nor the desire to influence and intimidate others like Albus, nor the willingness to act to accrue power like Lucius, nor Lily's creative drive. When he was young and arrogant, he had been driven by a desire to leave a mark on the world, to be celebrated and recognized for his power, to be feared. Yet as he'd told Percy, once, this drive had brought him none of the rewards he'd sought when he was young and foolish. Severus finds that Azkaban agrees with him, to his surprise. Something must have happened with the Dementors during the war, for many of them have fled the Ministry service and not returned, leaving Azkaban in the hands of a dozen wizarding guards, aided by a few remaining Dementors. The food is quite intolerable, but it is warm and served at prompt intervals. His cell is threadbare and uncomfortable, but Severus is practiced enough at wandless magic that he is able to improve his conditions to the point where they are adequate. He finds it pleasing to have his world narrowed to such a small, unchanging space. Severus has indexed his body numerous times and found that the most prevalent feeling gripping his limbs is exhaustion. He has been fighting a war for nearly 2 decades and fighting his own private battles for a decade more than that, and he is tired. Even the idea of being in a potions lab exhausts him. Everything exhausts him, except for the slow, painful reconstruction of his occlumency shields, dipping into each of the key memories over the last 30 years and evaluating each. Percy, Lily, Lucius, Regulus. He examines them all carefully, every misstep in school and angry outburst, every decision point where he could have turned his fate to the better. He supposes that part of him ought to be upset that he does not receive any visitors. He would have thought perhaps Minerva would have come for the obligatory questioning, or even the minister. None of his old Death Eater compatriots dare to return to Azkaban, not after they'd so narrowly escaped with their lives from his fate. He surmises that there has been no public reveal of his true role, and therefore the public has no reason to believe of him anything other than the truth. He is a murderer and a Death Eater, and he deserves to be forgotten. Although it is not strictly true that he does not receive a single visitor. Of the 12 human Azkaban guards, 11 are of Slytherin house, and all are pure-blooded young wizards under the age of 25, which means unfortunately that he had taught an even dozen of them. They come, one by one, in nervous spurts, some to merely stare, wide-eyed at him, and others to attempt to curry favor. What they think he can do for them, Severus cannot say, given that if anything they have the power to make his life quite miserable. Yet come they do, and some bring small gifts, or extra portions of food, and the Bulstrode boy even brings him a book to read, and the youngest of the Avery lot occasionally snuggles in a daily profit. It is strange, but perhaps they assume he will be freed one day and remember their furtive attempts. Whenever Severus grows tired of his solitude, or begins to wonder with impatient curiosity about the world outside his 4-cell walls, he reminds himself that this was the allotted time for repentance, and he does not deserve anything other than what he has. The war is over. It has taken its last victims, and Severus has implausibly survived. To be bored is the least of the punishments which he deserves. June 1998, by the third month, however, Severus has relived a lifetime of memories and cannot quite decide on his next move. To repent, what is it precisely that he must do? He had tortured himself through hours of exquisitely painful memories. His father striking down his mother, while he cowers behind a door. His first public humiliation in potions, when he had not known how to use a mortar and pestle, outing him as at least a half-blood, if not worse. Being rejected from the Slug Club, calling Lily a mudblood. The sick feeling in his stomach every time he heard Lucius brag to their classmates about meeting the dangerous wizard known only as Lord Voldemort. He'd watched his later memories too, watched impassively as his younger self killed a muggle, killed Lily, killed Dumbledore. Severus had felt the requisite guilt, lingering in it, apologizing in his head with as much specificity as he could wring from his wrongs. He'd written up a plan for his solicitor to donate his meager wealth to the Muggle-born foundation that Hermione Granger was giving interviews about in the Prophet, something he hopes Lily would have approved of had he been able to tell her about it. He had contemplated self-flagellation, but try as he might, he could not quite understand who or what would be benefited by his harming himself physically. And anyway, after a decade of service to 2 harsh masters, Severus is capable of detaching his mind from awareness of physical pain whenever it lashed through his body, thereby rendering such punishment useless. Thus stymied, Severus spends a majority of his 3rd month in Azkaban sitting quietly by, watching as the sun passed through the enchanted window, and wondering if he had exhausted the potential of his life and ought to take the final step toward death. It is therefore both welcome and unwelcome to have the guards announce that he has visitors, Andromeda and Narcissa, sweeping through the ward with their characteristic black presence, ignoring the calls and cries from the other Azkaban inhabitants with ease. Narcissa is dressed in simple, black mourning robes. Severus cannot imagine it would be easy for her to publicly mourn Lucius. He has not read too many of the papers, but he can easily picture what the Daily Prophet would have to say about the Dark Lord's right-hand man. Nevertheless, Severus knows that Narcissa and Lucius cared for each other in their own way. Andromeda is also dressed for mourning, though as far as Severus knows, everyone she cares about survived the war. Solidarity, perhaps. "You're going to be sentenced to death," Andromeda says, as her opening, earning her an exasperated look by her sister. Severus has experienced both Andromeda's bluntness and Narcissa's lengthy prevarication before, and he finds he prefers the elder Black's directness, though this news, while not unexpected, settles unpleasantly in his stomach. He wills his limbs to be still, so the decision has been made without his input, which he supposes is a fitting end to his life. "I see." "Because," Andromeda continues heatedly, "you have elected not to participate in the trials, and Harry Potter has been saying that you were responsible for his parents' deaths, not to mention Albus Dumbledore's. Harry Potter. Severus had been relieved to hear the boy survived, but he cannot say that he has regretted that the interlude of their lives, where he had to be constantly aware of the boy's many doings, has finally ended. Perhaps permanently, it seems. I see. It will take nothing short of a miracle to turn the public opinion away from sheer bloodlust, Narcissa interjects, as her sister nearly swells with rage at the inadequacy of Severus' response. He hides a smile. He has such few pleasures left that it still pleases him to know he can affect someone so strongly with such few words. You must stand trial, Severus, and you must agree to testimony under veritaserum. Am I the only Death Eater to be killed? Severus motions toward the rows of cells. Many of the Death Eaters escaped sentences, but many line the walls, too stupid or too poor or too arrogant to establish proper defenses for their trials. Or will it be a mass execution? Just you, so far, Andromeda spits at him angrily. But I suppose you won't provide any evidence on your behalf. You're just like him. Andy. No, Andromeda snaps back. Severus straightens and watches her carefully. There is an edge to her demeanor that he cannot properly place. But then again, he is not particularly familiar with this black sister. He turns his attention instead to Narcissa, who has intersected with his life in numerous ways over the last 20 years. But he cannot read the truth from her face either. He watches carefully as Narcissa lays her hand on Andromeda's shoulder before Andromeda shakes it off with an angry gesture. I'm tired of this. All I want to do is go on holiday with my husband and my daughter, but instead, I have to spend my time shepherding these idiots into a semblance of a normal life. Merlin, Severus, do you want to die? The Dark Lord couldn't kill you, so you'll let the minister. Severus contemplates having his private life aired to the public and then gives a small, controlled shrug. There will be no way to prove his innocence to the caliber required by these trials without uncovering the whole sordid story of Lily, not to mention of Percy, and Severus does not feel capable of speaking about either. In truth, I did not think it likely I would survive the war at all, he says, considering the idea that he may be set to death. He waits to see if his mind or magic will rebel at the idea, but both are silent. I do not wish to give testimony. Harry does not want me to speak of the items we destroyed, Andromeda says, a pleading edge of anger in her tone. You have to talk to him, Severus. I can provide memories to speak to your cooperation in this manner. He is correct to not speak of them. There is much that we would be better off forgetting. The force of Voldemort's gaze, for instance, when it had settled on a 16-year-old Severus Snape and made him feel seen. Severus did not have the same type of relationship to Voldemort as Percy had to Tom, or at least, what he suspected Percy did to Tom. But he too had been Voldemort's pupil. He too had been asked once to swear eternal fealty to the Dark Lord's soul. He too had escaped his fate only by the Dark Lord's sudden demise. Andromeda gives him the type of stubborn look that Severus saw on her daughter's face numerous times during her 7-year tenure at Hogwarts. Narcissa's face is more composed, though he is surprised to see an undercurrent of resentment when she levies the force of her pale, lovely eyes on him. You were involved in Lucius' death. Severus nods shortly. He had provided her with as full of an account as he could spare in memory of the man that had bound them both together. It is not your fault that you survived when my husband did not, says Narcissa with some difficulty. Severus blinks, surprised. But it would be an insult to his honor to go to such an unnecessary death. Severus cannot help but say, though he modulates his tone to be more gentle out of respect, but what of living an unnecessary life? My life is to do with what I choose, Narcissa. I do not wish to provide testimony. If that mandates my death, then I am reconciled to that option. Read this, Andromeda says savagely, thrusting a letter into the bars. My daughter found it addressed to you. They leave soon after, though both try in their separate ways to convince him otherwise. Once his cell has returned to its former silence, Severus considers his impending execution more carefully. He had been relieved to survive, in the instinctive way that all animals are to escape death. On the contrary, he cannot say he would not be relieved to die either. His careful consideration of his 36 years of living has left him with the indelible impression that he has fulfilled his purpose in life, to the best of his ability, and he has nothing more to offer the world. He cannot teach at Hogwarts, Not again, even if he were cleared in a trial. It would be too humiliating to return to his previous position as Bat in the dungeon, and he cannot imagine that he would be able to hold the respect of any of the students who would return. Severus considers a lifetime of solitude alone in his parents' house, surrounded by muggles, and shudders to himself. Traveling alone holds no appeal to him, nor pursuing potions research, nor practicing his magic, nor any of the other insipid activities that seem to fill the lives of the masses. What use does he have for acquiring things, or decorating his house, or flaunting his wealth? Lucius' manor had been more of a cage than Severus' muggle shack had ever been. Lily would be there in death, and Lucius, and his mother, and Regulus, and now Percy too. The letter that Andromeda passed to him sits in the corner of his cell and the edge of his attention until the evening, when it grows too large for him to ignore any longer. As he'd known it would be, it is from Percy. He contemplates it for nearly an hour, unmoving from his position on the metal bench, ignoring the supper tray that has long gone cold, despite the guard's pitiable attempt at a ever-warming charm. He does not imagine that the younger Tonks would have been able to find the letter concealed in Percy's things, so he has to assume that Percy had given the letter to her prior to his death, which would mean that Percy had known he was going to die. Unless the letter was from earlier, from a time where Percy had felt frightened. He reaches suddenly for the scroll and unrolls it, his eyes going to the date inked neatly on the upper right-hand corner, as if the scroll were one of the many assignments that Percy had handed to him, addressed in the same way. Percy had written him the letter the night prior to the final duel. Severus tries to think back to how Percy had seemed those last few hours. He had not seemed frightened, at least not to the point where he would write a letter to say his goodbyes. Presumably Percy had been alone. Otherwise he wouldn't have found the privacy to write any letter at all, which would imply to Severus that Tom had not appeared to threaten Percy in any particular way. The Dark Lord had not threatened Percy, either. Rather, he'd taken pleasure in informing Severus that he intended to take Percy as his sworn companion, a position Severus had denied by carefully never giving his resurrected lord an answer. In short, Severus can only think of one scenario. Percy had seen how Tom gravitated to him and had planned to die by his own hand if need be, to give Potter or Severus or Andromeda the edge required to defeat Tom if it became necessary. They had known the likely sequence of events. Potter first, then Voldemort, and then Tom would be unchallenged and victorious. Severus had entertained his own apprehensions about this plan, namely a concern surrounding who would be capable of defeating Tom. But he had agreed with Percy that to push the Dark Lord to attack Harry was the first priority. Severus had been prepared to sacrifice himself in a duel if it came down to that. And so, it seems, had Percy. Slowly, the events of the night unfold in front of Severus' eyes, as horrid and unwelcome as any of his nightmares. Tom had been torturing Harry for information, and Percy had pretended to give it to him. Perhaps Percy had even told the truth. Severus knew from experience that Percy was painfully capable of doling out the truth with such exquisite precision that it wounded more than any lie possibly could. He had distracted Tom, and then perhaps dueled him, or ingested a potion to kill himself, or pointed his wand to his head and taken his own life. For all of Tom's heartlessness, Severus had seen how Tom jealously observed Percy. He would have been shocked to see his prize cut down, and that moment of inattention would have been just enough for Harry Potter to gasp out a killing curse. "You blithering idiot," Severus snaps at Percy in his head, who gives him that irritating, rueful half-smile that always preceded some idiotically sentimental comment. Percy had thanked him so many times that Severus had itched to hear yet another honorable and honest phrase come out of the boy's mouth. In fact, he reads the first few paragraphs in an angered rush, unable to prevent himself from rolling his eyes. The boy had called him a teacher and a friend, and thanked him for sharing his burden. "I killed you," Severus snarls, his fingers tensing around the scroll, though his magic sparks to protect the scroll from harm. "And you're thanking me. I always told you to guard yourself more carefully. Please forgive me for my failings with Tom. I have let you down, and I am ashamed of my weaknesses. I do not know why Tom affected me the way that he did. Perhaps if I had another lifetime to live, I could figure it out. With only a few days left, I can only apologize and hope that you understand. Severus feels a pulse jump in his jaw as he reads this, a sign of how close he is to losing control. He is about to check himself, to engage in his customary occlumency, exercises to bundle his emotions out of reach. But then he glances around the cell and realizes that he is alone in here, and nobody can see him if he indulges in his anger. Though he is careful to raise a wandless ward around the perimeter of the cage, he may be willing to let his anger unfurl through the cell, but he will not allow anyone else the freedom to witness it. Stronger wizards than Percival Weasley have been affected by the Dark Lord. Perhaps Percy did not understand that, only having seen the post-resurrection version of the Dark Lord, a monster out of horror tales. It had only been in the last few months that Severus had begun to see the worrisome signs of the Dark Lord's true self peeking through the crazed, cruel facade. The Voldemort that had recruited Severus, Lucius, Bellatrix, and a smattering of other strong wizards had been the most intoxicating, charismatic man that any of them had ever met. That Voldemort could read the thoughts out of his followers' heads as if they'd shouted them through cupped hands. That Voldemort's magic was a dozen times stronger than it ever would be again, a truly dizzying rush of power that lifted them and made them feel fiercely strong, as if they were capable of raising the entire world to dust and creating it again from scratch. That Voldemort had been sly and clever and witty, conversant in more topics than Severus had even heard of, academic and intellectual and challenging. He would set Severus to researching obscure branches of magic. Had Severus spent those first months out of Hogwarts leafing carefully through old tomes that he'd swear hadn't been touched for the last 3 centuries, and then slyly point out an error in Severus, reasoning, even though he'd checked himself infinite times. He'd cowed Lucius, the undisputed pureblood prince of their time, and seduced the dangerous and incomparable Bellatrix Black. He could match the cruelty and violence of the Lestrange brothers, who even in school had been widely feared. He could whip up any group of dinner guests into a murderous frenzy, just with a few well-placed words. And what had really astounded them, the arrogant teenagers that they had all been, he controlled their parents too. Severus, mother had told him, she was proud of him just twice in his life. Once, when he'd received a Hogwarts letter, and once when he'd shown her the dark mark on his arm. Abraxas Malfoy sat proudly at Voldemort's right, and the fathers of all of Severus, classmates, men that he'd long feared and cautiously emulated. And Percy was blind enough to apologize that he'd been compromised by interacting with 3 incarnations of the Dark Lord's soul, day after day, for nearly 5 years. Severus would have killed the boy if by some miracle he had survived and was sitting in front of him. Promise me one thing, Severus, on the basis of all that we have shared. Your penance is complete. You have saved the world in a way, and you have brought Lily's son to adulthood the best you could. Do not mourn his part in this play any more than mine. We have both faced our deaths with clear eyes, as Regulus did, and Dumbledore, and Lily as well, and decided that we would face death in the hope of a better future. I know that such words from me may be unwelcome or unexpected, and I do not blame you for your anger when you read them. Yet if I could ask you one thing, it would be that you live, Severus, free of guilt. Do not waste the gifts you have been given, nor the skills you have painfully obtained. Faced your deaths with clear eyes, snorts Severus, though his angered tone has lost some of his rancor. You should have told me your plan. What gifts Percy must have thought Severus had been given, or skills that were worthy of being exercised in peace. Severus had always known the boy to be an idealist, if not an optimist, but these lines seem nothing more than foolishness. If Percy had spoken to Severus about his misguided noble desire to sacrifice himself, Severus would have told him firmly that they would all have been better served if he were the one to kill himself. Percy had the misfortune to relive a decade of his life. It would have been the least that Severus could have done to trade his life to provide the boy a chance to live beyond these pre-written years. Severus spends the 4 nights before his scheduled execution writing a brief account of the second life of Percival Ignatius Weasley and his foolishly heroic attempts to end the war. Of his own participation in such events, he adds little, only filling out some of the details or providing his analysis as to why a given action had been in the context of its time. the correct one. Percy had never known, for instance, that his bold manipulation of Yaxley to end the Muggle-born trials had likely resulted in dozens of lives saved. Severus had not wanted to tell Percy what the Dark Lord had planned for the Muggle-borns discovered to be traitors, given that at any time Voldemort could have reignited his interest in experimenting with the Muggles, and the boy would have been crushed with guilt that he'd sent them off to Azkaban, rather than ferrying them out of the country. He includes as many of the details of the time travel ritual as he thinks will be sufficient to underscore the great personal risk that the boy had taken without providing enough clues for a copycat to attempt the same. Percy had all but killed himself, or so Severus concludes, based on nothing more than idealistic hope and a stubborn resolve to right his wrongs. Severus glosses over the issue of Tom, or at least the issue of how Percy had felt about Tom. Severus had seen often that the boy was enthralled by the Horcrux, but of course Tom would have done nothing save slyly stoke Percy's interest, perhaps with calculated gestures or words. It would most definitely have remained one-sided, and regardless, Severus does not think it a necessary component of the story, though Percy's influence over both versions of the Dark Lord had been not insignificant. Instead, he explains that Percy had lied to the Dark Lord every single day for half a decade, had managed to conceal his furtive activities from a portrait literally hanging on his wall, had manipulated not one but 3 slices of the same soul to take actions along the vectors that were favorable to them. At the very end, Weasley knew that his death would provide us with a sufficient distraction for one of us to defeat Tom, who otherwise would have been far too powerful magically and otherwise. He was the only one of us capable of breaching Tom's wards, despite the pull on his magic. We had auxiliary plans ready to defeat Tom in time if we had not succeeded that afternoon, but Tom could have wreaked unknown havoc on the world in the interim. Weasley's bravery ended the war decisively. Here Severus pauses, his quill hovering in the air. The guard had provided the scrolls when Severus had asked for them. It was the young Bulstrode, who still squeaked in fear whenever Severus so much glanced at his direction. He provided nearly a dozen extra scrolls, but Severus cannot think of anything else to add, except many of us owe our lives to him. Then he nods decisively, rolls the scrolls together, and traces his fingers down the seam, his magic activating to seal them together. He checks the time. It is nearly morning, barely hours from the time of his execution, perfectly scheduled. Severus calls for Bulstrode, who takes the scroll and nervously promises to deliver his final account to Minerva McGonagall the second that his shift ends. Bulstrode hovers near Severus' cell door, even after the parcel has exchanged hands, until Severus is forced to look up and irritably snap. "What?" "I'm sorry," Bulstrode says in a rush, "that you're to be executed." The boy flushes gracelessly but presses on. "My father told me that you pressured him to send me to my aunt, to be her companion. I hated it at the time, but it kept me away from him." Severus raises an eyebrow, both at the hushed, fearful reference of him and at the reminder of what he'd done for the few Slytherin students whose parents listened to him over the Dark Lord. Severus had carefully, firmly bullied as many weak-willed fathers as he could to send their sons to relatives, to university, to adventure if they must, and though he'd never even insinuated that to do so would be to save these sons from service, many of the parents had, thankfully, understood. Some hadn't. Severus had told Kerevin Avery to send his son away, and Kerevin had all but threatened to accuse Severus of treason. The elder Avery son had died within the first 6 months of the war, killed by Tom to cover his misdeeds. "You may pay me back by delivering the scroll at the first opportunity," Severus says firmly, and the boy nods eagerly and disappears. Left to himself for the final time, Severus examines his feelings about this new idea. In truth, he'd all but forgotten that he'd ever risked interfering. When he conducted the harsh, grim tally of his wrongdoings, he'd forgotten to weigh in that he had saved a few of the students, perhaps, and managed to distract the Carrows from Ginevra and Neville's rebellious campaign long enough for them to establish a tenuous stronghold on the 7th floor of the castle. These acts do not negate even the most harmless of his crimes, but he finds to his surprise that he is cheered, albeit briefly, at the small counterbalance they provide. Perhaps if he does see Lily in death, he will tell her about them. Severus is so prepared for his death that it comes to his surprise when the Minister of Magic himself arrives to collect him and brings him, unchained, to the minister's office. Severus had been expecting the gallows, a public hanging, or at least a public killing curse. Materializing back into his body in the ministry, Severus has to question whether he'd prefer to be privately executed here or in Azkaban. Perhaps in Hogwarts, if he had to choose, immobilized and then dropped off the edge of the astronomy tower so that he may contemplate his many sins during the brief journey to the ground. Scrimgeour offers Severus the plush chair in front of his desk and takes the leather seat opposite. Steepling his fingers, Scrimgeour surveys him. Other wizard had been at Hogwarts at the same time as Severus. He had been head boy for Severus' first year, which Severus remembers vividly as it had been the last Slytherin head boy until Regulus. They had never spoken, but Severus had kept tabs on the other man's career and had been cautiously relieved to hear from Percy that he'd been squirreled away by the Order. "Not so sure what to do with you," Scrimgeour says finally. Severus smiles thinly. "I am partial to the killing curse myself." Scrimgeour raises his bushy eyebrows. "You've caused quite a fuss by refusing to talk. You've quite the small but vocal band of supporters, insisting it was all a plan by the esteemed late Albus Dumbledore." Scrimgeour waves his hand in the air, as if to encompass all of the emotional revelations and arguments that Severus had caused indirectly to occur. On his part, Severus cannot think who might have comprised his band of supporters. Narcissa, perhaps. "I did not want my past to be aired in front of the public," Severus says in response to the implied criticism. He smiles thinly. "I am prepared to accept the consequences of that decision." Scrimgeour looks slyly at Severus and says lightly, "Did you not hear? You've been pardoned. Early this morning. Executive order by the minister. A privately sealed decision. I'll take your thanks whenever you can muster it. I've finally adjusted back to English time, only to be rudely awoken at 5 in the bleeding morning." Severus is uncomfortably reminded of the First Wizarding War, when he'd been in a similar position, though much less reconciled to his death, when Albus had saved him so magnanimously. Irritation sharpens his tone. "Nobody thought to inform me, I gather." "I most definitely sent a missive," the minister says blandly. Severus wants to roll his eyes. Perhaps the minister wanted to flex his arm of power or punish Severus for his misdeeds. Certainly no missive would have been sent to Azkaban. Though Severus cannot say he dislikes Scrimgeour, he can see plainly that the other wizard is expecting tears of gratitude or something equally inane, and Severus cannot bring himself to indulge him, pardon or not. Instead, he only asks, his voice carefully even, "Whose testimony was sufficient to free me?" "Anonymous parties," Scrimgeour replies, enunciating the words carefully. "Or rather, parties that wish very much to remain anonymous. Albus' portrait, more likely than anything, or perhaps Narcissa, or perhaps Minerva." Severus mentally reviews the content of the scroll that he'd sent her. Merlin, he hopes she hadn't been stupid enough to show it to the minister. He hadn't envisioned being alive for the fallout of his action. For once, he'd thought he had the freedom to be reckless, to deposit a problem into the laps of some other people rather than himself. Arrogant tusks a voice in his head that sounds rather like the Dark Lord. "You've always been arrogant, Severus. You are not surprised to see that I have miraculously returned from the dead," Scrimgeour says, enjoying his own private amusement. "You should hear some of the things they are saying about me." "I would hope that you had informed them all in return that your stalwart assistant faked your death," Severus responds coolly. Percy would be rolling in his grave to hear that even after his death, those who ought to know better continue to disavow him. Severus considers again the scroll he'd impulsively sent Minerva and cannot say he regrets it. The boy would get his recognition, one way or another. "So you did know." Scrimgeour nods to himself, as if confirming a private theory. Severus' face immediately sours. To think of hordes of ignorant, supercilious wizards pouring through his memoirs as if they were the latest serial novel, condescendingly discussing his motivations, claiming to understand his actions, to assume they knew what drove his decisions. "Calm yourself, Severus," the minister says with a loud, booming laugh. Severus grits his teeth and wonders deliberately how Percy had handled Scrimgeour's forced joviality, instead of contemplating which of the many spells to torture that Severus knows intimately would be best used to wipe the smile off the other man's face. A second later, Scrimgeour leans forward, and his face is serious now, and his tone somber. "I owe Percy Weasley my life," he says seriously, "and I do not intend to share what I learned this morning from Minerva." In truth, it gladdens me to know that he was not alone in his task. Severus gives a short, abrupt nod, releasing his fingers from their tense grip on his wand. "What excuse do you plan to use to justify my release?" "The truth," Scrimgeour says, as if it ought to be obvious. At Severus' tense shoulders, he raises an eyebrow. "You were working for Albus Dumbledore. His portrait confirmed it." "With," Severus cannot help but correct. "Not for." The look that Scrimgeour gives Severus is strangely understanding. "Yes," the minister says softly. "My mistake. You were working with Albus Dumbledore and Percy Weasley. You were instrumental in orchestrating the defeat of the man we called Lord Voldemort." Severus manages to control his instinctive flinch at the name, but something in Scrimgeour's face informs him that he did not manage to hide it entirely. 3 months in Azkaban, and Severus has lost some of his edge, some of the instinctive control over his body and his features that had been his greatest weapon in this war. Not like Percy, whose thoughts so often writ themselves across his face, though he soon learned to adopt the carefully blank mask that all of the Dark Lord's followers at some point perfected. "Am I to pay a fine?" "A fine?" The minister shakes his head incredulously. "Merlin's beard, Severus. We're going to give you an order of Merlin." Severus' instinctive rush of revulsion is so swift and absolute that his magic flares around him, darkly upset. "Calm down," he orders himself harshly. The time in Azkaban has influenced him far more than he'd thought. He will need to undergo extensive repair to his shields and his controls before he can be in public. If he is not to die, he will have to practice once again how to live. "No. I'm afraid this is not negotiable," Scrimgeour says coolly. His eyes watch Severus carefully, and Severus straightens, wiping all traces of emotion from his face. "I will refuse it, publicly, if I must." Severus has never been inside the office of the Minister of Magic before, though he knows that Percy spent a majority of his time inside the plush interior. He allows his eyes to rove over the details, noticing the elaborate detailing on the trim, the enchanted window, the stately wooden desk, anything to avoid having to meet Scrimgeour's eyes, which seem to sear over the distance between them. Severus does not know what Scrimgeour wants, and that makes him uncomfortable. Surely the neatest solution to the conundrum at hand is to pardon Severus quietly and release him to his own devices, never to be seen of again. To elevate Severus to the position of receiving an order of Merlin, to force him into the spotlight, to be publicly reviled and scorned, to make a mockery of the system of honors that stretch back far before either of them. Scrimgeour breaks the silence. His voice is urgent, strangely so. "We owe you our lives as well. Or do you deny that?" "I did not do it for you." Severus firms his lips and remains silent. They will either execute him or leave him be. He has said his piece, and he no longer needs to participate in this conversation. Scrimgeour sighs to himself tiredly. "This conversation is not over," he warns Severus. "But I recognize that you came to my office expecting to die, and you may need some time to understand the news that I've given you today." So Severus is allowed to leave, allowed to collect his meager personal effects from Azkaban. The Bulstrode boy looks damned thrilled to see him alive, which embarrasses Severus in front of Scrimgeour, and allowed to make his way to whatever hovel suits him best. Of the options, Severus chooses his house. He endures nearly an hour of silence, sitting in the downstairs parlor with his cup of tea, before the mockery from the dust under the chairs and the stains on the wall rises to an unbearable pitch. For some reason, all he can imagine is Percy's face. The first time he'd been taken to this room, his surprise that the formidable potions master of Hogwarts lived in such a dank, depressing place. Percy had created for himself quite the plush flat, though the rooms he had rented were small and narrow. The desk that Percy had bought for himself had probably cost more money than all the furniture inside Severus. Pathetic excuse for a home office, not to mention the expensive rug underfoot and the satin sheets. It seems so starkly unfair that Severus is alive and the boy is dead, that the pathetic state of his ancestral Muggle home seems to mock the boy's good name. Severus finds himself standing and directing a battalion of cleaning charms onto the multitude of stains, smudges, and smears, marring the unpleasant rooms where he'd grown up before he can think too closely on why his throat feels tight, almost as if caught in a sob. Asterisk, Severus visits Lily's house, of course, though Lily has not lived there for nearly 2.5 decades. The Muggle family that owns the house now has a young boy and an insufferable dog, and Severus hides beneath a disillusionment charm until they all troop out of the house to some cheery outing to the local park. Severus would tell them that the child is more likely to encounter cigarette bums and shattered bottles than squirrels and leaves at the park, or at least the park that they seem to be walking toward. But they've plainly just moved into the neighborhood, and Severus supposes it will be an educational experience for the family to understand that left is not the correct direction to walk when leaving their row of manicured houses. Lily's parents had never been wealthy, but they'd existed in a level of middle-class comfort that had seemed alien to Severus, who had been born into a smudge of dirt and never outgrown his grimy surroundings. As Severus moved soundlessly through the kitchen, largely unchanged save for the row of gleaming modern Muggle appliances on the counter, he can vividly picture Lily and her father teaching him how to make a cucumber and cheese sandwich, the edges cut off so wastefully. Severus had watched the edges with eagle eyes until Lily's father, a strange expression passing through his face, had caught him at it and piled them all on the rim of Severus' plate. The memory embarrasses him now, and he shakes his head, trailing one finger over the gleaming countertops. Why Lily's parents had allowed her to associate with him would always be a mystery to him. Perhaps it would have been better for all parties if they had warned her away from the dirty boy with the large nose. Certainly Petunia had nobly tried her best. In the backyard, the large oak tree with the wide, smooth branches still towers overhead, though Severus is discomfited to realize that his head brushes the lowest branches. One of Lily's most visible indications of magic had occurred when she'd fallen off the spindly branch with the cleft midway through its bough. Her magic had caught her and carried her safely down, and Severus had caught the frightened, puzzled looks that her parents had exchanged, though they had switched to relief only seconds later. That look had stayed with him, and he'd spent the next week hiding from Lily, convinced that he was the cause of her magic, that he was bringing the magic out of her, that he would be responsible for her parents treating her with the same disgusted horror that Tobias ladled on his son at every opportunity. Severus shakes his head, smiling bitterly, and snaps a small branch off the edge of the bough, putting the spindly twig in his pocket. He leaves behind the Evans residence and continues to walk down the well-manicured path, noting familiar fence posts and porch lights as his feet carry him automatically down the street. Lily and Severus had spent a majority of their time at the river, but he would always walk her home, as his mother had raised him to do, though she would have been horrified to know that his well-bred manners were being used on a dirty mudblood girl. 4 streets down there is a small chapel, and Severus, his fingers still clasped over the twig in his pocket, hesitates and then strides in. The chapel is silent, as he'd always imagined it would be, and empty. He takes a seat in the back row and sits quietly, folding and unfolding a small leaf between his fingers. His family had not been religious, of course, and neither had Lily's, though he can remember that the Evans had visited the chapel irregularly, as most of the families in the neighborhood had. Severus had never been inside, but he'd always imagined that there would be an air of serenity, of holiness, of peace, something that would resonate deep inside him, something that might nip at his chest, but ultimately bring him comfort. But it is only a building, and though he bows his head and tries to reach out with his awareness to sense anything special around him, he finds that it smells like wet paint and plaster, and the bench is hard beneath his legs, and if he concentrates, he can hear the priest on the telephone in the other room, organizing some sort of summer service. His feet carry him instead to the river, to the spot where he'd used to meet with Lily, under the wide branches of the willow. Severus crosses his legs and leans against the branch with only a hint of self-consciousness. He is still under the disillusionment charm, so he is as invisible as he can get without Potter's hallowed cloak. His body aches in this position, more so than it used to, but he forces his legs to comply and looks out at the softly moving water. Lily, what am I supposed to do? 5 days he'd spent savagely scouring his house, cleaning every single cobweb and smear of dirt, ridding the place of all of the sad, dingy furniture that his mother had managed to obtain from yard sales and rummage bins and donations. He'd ruthlessly trashed every single one of the unmatched mugs and chipped porcelain plates, binned the broken mirrors in the downstairs bathroom and the ugly hand towels that had hung next to the chipped toilet, and reduced the sofa that he used to cower behind to a satisfying pile of ash. He'd purchased back the essentials: a bed, a chair, a desk. It had only taken him 5 days to transform his house from the place of his memories to something slightly improved, and he'd stretched out each task to take as long as it possibly could, carrying the furniture by hand out of the door, bagging it manually into large trash bags, and scheduling a time for the local garbage company to pick up the remnants of his parents' things. On this, the 6th day, he completed the walk that he'd been dreading, through Lily's neighborhood and down to the river. He supposes he ought to talk to Minerva, who had been sending him daily owls that he carefully ignored. But repentance did not seem to be coming to him any more easily in this corner of the world than it had in Azkaban. His life stretches in front of him, so damned long and unstructured, that it in truth fills him with a sharp edge of anxiety. Lily would have countless hobbies to pursue, countless passions to develop, countless friends to support. Even at 20, Lily had been the most interesting person he'd known. "Lily, please, help me." But Lily does not answer. Of course, Lily does not answer. Severus has not heard anything from Lily, not for the last 17 years. Percy's voice echoes in his head, unbidden and unwelcome. "Yet if I could ask you one thing, it would be that you live, Severus, free of guilt. Do not waste the gifts you have been given, nor the skills you have painfully obtained." The part of the river bank that belongs to Percy does not provide any answers that Lily's corner had kept from him. Live, Severus, free of guilt. Severus tosses a handful of stones savagely into the water and watches blankly as the ripples spread over the surface of the water. "It should have been you," he says into the air. "Both of you." If Percy had been in front of him, dangling that infernal letter in front of his face, Severus would have told him one thing: that to live had always been his curse and his burden, and that if Severus could choose one thing to do with his freedom, it would not be to live at all. Thus, Severus agrees to meet with Minerva the next time that she sends him a shrieking owl requesting his presence. He makes it to Hogwarts the manual way, the night bus, the long walk from Hogsmeade. He goes with his robes pulled over his head, his face transfigured just slightly as to be less recognizable. Minerva would have allowed him to flew into the office, but something inside of Severus wants to walk through the grounds of Hogwarts for the last time, smelling the sharp pine resin and hearing the slither of the wind through the leaves. Minerva meets him at the gates. Severus had been curious, despite himself, as to whether the wards would still recognize him, but Minerva opens the gates with a subtle gesture of her fingers before he can test his access. He stills his hand by his side and nods tersely at her. Her face is impassive, but Severus has spent over a decade as her colleague. She holds herself stiffly and inclines her head with an abrupt, jerky movement. Nervous. "Severus." "Minerva." For a prolonged second they stare at each other, their positions so swiftly reversed from just a few months prior. Then Minerva turns on her heel and motions him forward. "Let's go to my office." A barely perceptible pause before my. Severus contemplates that as they walk through the castle. Perhaps Minerva has not adjusted to the oddity of Albus' office answering to her any more than Severus had in his short tenure as the headmaster of Hogwarts. Indeed, when Minerva opens the passageway to the office, Albus, she says, as if an intruder could not easily guess that password, he sees that she, like he, had barely changed the interior. Where Severus' display of potions and books had replaced Albus' glittering silver instruments, Minerva has set out a selection of mundane and rare materials, everything from simple wooden branches to expensive gemstones. The rest of the room remains the same. "Severus," says Albus, and Severus smiles bitterly at his former master. Minerva settles herself behind the headmaster's desk with some hesitation. Severus would have told her that there is a manual way to adjust the height of the seat, as the chair is spelled against magics, but she will figure it out in time, as he did. What she does next surprises him. With a whispered command, all of the portraits fall silent, including Albus. Severus blinks. He had not known that was possible. All of his conversations with Albus had been careful, with the knowledge that dozens of portraits were listening. The former headmasters and headmistresses of Hogwarts were bound to silence as commanded by the current occupant of the office, but Severus had never expected to hold the position for a long time. If they failed in their task, it could be Voldemort who next sat where Minerva now sits. Minerva smiles wryly at his surprise. I've not figured out all of the secrets of this office, but I'm making my way through them best I can. Severus remains silent. There are a variety of things that he could say, and none of them seem suitable. Minerva, luckily, has always understood him better than most. She brings her hands together over the desk, interlacing her fingers, and eyes him from under her emerald green glasses. Severus has the thought, as he's had several times before, that his former professor has perfected the art of making even grown men feel 11 years old under the force of that gaze. I received your scroll, she says crisply, moving them swiftly past the conversational quagmire that small talk would have entailed. I have not shared it in its entirety with anyone, even Albus, though I copied over a selection of details to share with the minister to stand in as your testimony. Which details? Nearly all of them, Minerva admits, though I wrangled Rufus into an unbreakable vow. I told him of the Horcruxes, of Mr. Weasley's discovery of them during his time at Hogwarts, and of your furtive quest to destroy them without Voldemort's knowledge. This time, Severus does not flinch, at least not externally. He merely nods. He cannot say he agrees with her decision to inform Scrimgeour of the Horcruxes, but he is their minister of magic, and to force him into an unbreakable vow would have been no easy feat. Minerva continues, I admit, the news of Mr. Weasley's prior activities were difficult to read. I thank you for including the entire truth, or what I presume is the closest to the entire truth that you would ever share with anyone. It explained much that I still did not understand. Severus frowns despite himself. He had included details on Percy's time travel largely to underscore the great personal risk that the boy had foolishly taken, and to ensure that another person would know the details after Severus was executed. What had it explained for Minerva? Mr. Weasley revealed much to me, though inadvertently, Minerva explains, noting the ripple of confusion that crossed over his face. He often displayed knowledge of magic far beyond his years, and a conviction in his activities that could not be explained merely by fear of what Voldemort may grow to be. That he had lived through it once before clarified his knowledge and his dedication. He did not live through it before, Severus corrects. At least not in the way that you are imagining. Much changed with his interference, though he was loath to admit it. I am not suggesting otherwise, Minerva says crisply. It is clear to me, even without knowledge of the prior timeline, that his activities would have changed a great deal, presumably for the positive. I was pointing out only that it would take a strong wizard to willingly live through Voldemort's reign, merely for the faintest chance of defeating him. Severus nods and subsides back into silence. He is impatient for Minerva to reveal why she brought him here. Severus does not enjoy speaking about Percy Weasley, even as it lifts a minute burden off of his shoulders to know that his scroll had the intended effect on Minerva. Why did you not tell me earlier? Minerva leans forward, some of her forced formality dropping away from her frame as she asks the question. I am one of the most knowledgeable experts on the field of time magic, as you very well know, Severus. I had worked in the Department of Time at the Ministry before I left to resume my apprenticeship with Albus. I held Mr. Weasley in high regard, and I knew enough of your story to trust you, Severus. Mr. Weasley told me, in his own way, what was to come. He hinted that Albus was dying, and that you would be the one to kill him. Severus cannot help his surprise from wrinkling his eyebrows. Percy told you this. And you did not know, Minerva confirms tartly, because I am capable of subtlety when needed. You could have trusted me, Severus, to keep your secrets. Percy had not told him that he had revealed such a thing to Minerva. Irritation colors his tone when he snaps. I could not trust anyone, Minerva. Did you trust Mr. Weasley? Stymied, Severus snaps his mouth shut and glowers at her. She knows the truth to this, even as it shames him and makes him feel vulnerable. I am glad, Minerva says, to his surprise. She smiles at him then, and to Severus, great disgust, it almost makes him feel warm. To know that you could trust each other. Your esteem for him is clear in this letter. Severus cannot begin to explain the complicated tangle of feelings that exists deep within him. His persistent irritation at Percy's optimistic foolishness, his regret over the boy's death, all of those moments of surprise when Percy had opened his mouth and changed the direction of the war indelibly. Severus had rewatched that final interaction between Percy, Lucius, and Voldemort, and on the fourth or fifth viewing he'd finally seen how neatly Percy had distracted the Dark Lord, how capably he'd led him toward the conclusion that he ought to challenge Potter despite the threat of the Elder Wand, how slyly he'd manipulated Voldemort's hatred of Albus. He did not deserve to die as he did, Severus says finally, the only thing that he can say with conviction and clarity. Minerva's response surprises him. Guilt is written all over her lined face, his instincts reading it off of her involuntary grimace to his statement before she has the presence of mind to clear her expression. What? Severus demands, his hand curling over his wand. I promise not to tell you, Minerva says softly, and he tenses, uncomfortable with the currents of emotions swirling around the room. But it is clear to me that you care for him, as I have rarely seen you care for anyone else. A pulse jumps in his throat as he clenches his jaw together, angered at the reference to Lily and the presumption that she understands his feelings toward the boy. What is it that you have withheld from me? Perhaps Potter was the one to kill Percy, or Minerva herself, or any of the Order members foolishly believing that they knew the truth. Perhaps Percy survived the initial attack, only to succumb to his injuries later. Perhaps they had watched Percy turn his wand on himself and remained motionless while he took his own life. Percy Weasley is alive, Minerva says gently, and Severus' world shatters again. March 1998, when Percy awakens for the first time, it takes him several long minutes to realize where he is. He's lying on his back, in a bed. The ceiling is white and well lit with bright lamps. Cannot smell any particular scent or hear any particular sounds, and so for a few minutes he just stares up at the ceiling and cannot remember who he is. There's a strange bliss in it, in the not knowing. He luxuriates in it for a few brief seconds before his brain immediately flags the drowsily content, feeling as alien, and clangs a loud alarm. Something is missing, and he shivers when he realizes it, his first movement since he woke up and blinked sleepily at the ceiling. Something is missing. A limb. No, he can feel his hands and wiggle his toes. Maybe he is deaf. Percy, says a voice, and he flinches, a movement that runs through his entire body and leaves him groaning in pain. So he can hear then, and his name is Percy, Percy Weasley. He is 21 years old and 34 years old. A candle, Hogwarts, a great tear in the sky, a terrible sadness, a deep longing for what could not be. Tom, he says, his eyes widening with panic. But the face that swims into his field of vision is one that is vaguely, although not immediately, familiar. His tired brain takes a few extra seconds to supply the name. Madame Pomfrey, Hogwarts. He is at Hogwarts. Tom is dead, says another voice. Percy turns his head slightly and flinches again. Harry, with a face like crumbling granite. Harry screaming, sobbing, crying, jerking madly through the air. You'll never understand what it's like to have something worth dying for. I'm sorry, Percy manages to get out. Harry looks away abruptly and jams his hands into his pockets, and Percy closes his eyes in shame. Mr. Weasley, says a third voice softly, and Percy drags his gaze over to his right. Professor McGonagall. She is looking grim and old, and it takes him a moment to register her voice. He is feeling so tired, so sluggish, and still with that mysterious feeling of loss. Mr. Weasley, do you remember what happened? Tom, torture, magic, Hogwarts, castle, blackness. No, he whispers. You killed. Tom, McGonagall says, and Percy follows her gaze over to Harry, who nods brusquely, and something backfired. The vow, Percy says involuntarily, and he screws his eyes shut. He does not need to hear McGonagall's next words to understand what happened to him. He has lost his magic. He had been trying to die, to use his dying wish to do good in the world, to wipe his slate clean. He had not wanted to wake. He had nothing to wake for, not now. Tom has taken everything from his heart, from his tired soul, and now he has taken his magic too. He's nothing more than a muggle, a squib. It would be better if he were blind or dead. He'd rather lose a limb than his magic. Panicking, he reaches out with his magic, but of course, nothing happens. His blood thuds hotly in his ears. Normally, if he concentrates, he can hear the thin hum of his magic around him, the constant noise no wizard is ever without. His hand reaches out and flexes, but no spark appears to dance around his fingers. He is so cold, he is so tired, he does not remember what it felt like before, he cannot forget. A vow, repeats McGonagall, her voice heavy. That explains much. Can you tell us the vow, Mr. Weasley? I swore on my magic not to harm Tom Riddle, Percy explains, his voice dull. It was the only way he would trust me. Vaguely, Percy is aware that the other occupants of the room are muttering, that Pomfrey is bending over him casting diagnostic spells. It matters not. He has lost his magic. He is no longer a wizard. He may as well be dead. Why isn't he dead? McGonagall has to repeat his name several times to get his attention. He looks at her expressionlessly, not bothering to raise his head from the pillow. We are going to try and fix this, she promises. But we need to know everything that happened. Can you tell us? Is the war over? Percy asks tonelessly. Yes, says McGonagall, reaching down to squeeze his hand. He cannot control another flinch at her touch. Yes, you're safe now. He does not react. Then it does not matter what happened. He cannot be budged to say another word. Not by McGonagall or Harry, not by Ginny or Draco or Ron or Hermione, not by Tonks or Shacklebolt or Scrimgeour. Percy spends many days in the hospital staring silently at the ceiling. Many people talk to him, but he allows their voices to pass over him like a gentle breeze. He cannot reach into his mind like he once could, but he can feel his mental shields hovering over the bounds of his consciousness, broken and screaming. He wraps his hand around the grey stone that is still in his pocket, but it feels cool and inert to the touch. He is already in Hogwarts, and he can see the effects of the magic around him, the floating lanterns in the hospital wing, the elf assigned to monitor his progress, the portraits on the walls. But he views them as if from behind a great glass wall, inviolate and cold, a wall of ice. He does not really think, either. He does not reflect on the journey that brought him here. He does not consider his regrets or his hopes. He most particularly does not think about Tom. From what he does here, and can't filter out, the war is over. He knows Scrimgeour has survived and is the minister because Scrimgeour comes and tells him and requires a verbal confirmation that Percy was listening before he leaves. Shacklebolt steps down politely from interim minister, passed over again. Everyone important has survived, it seems. Fred, George, Ginny, the rest of them too. This news is the only thing that can stir him, and when he hears he succeeded in at least those tasks, he feels all the more keenly that he ought to have died. He had completed his purpose. The rest doesn't really matter to Percy. Part of him wishes that it did. And Severus? Percy asks hoarsely, one of the few words that he is able to summon. McGonagall looks at him curiously. He is in Azkaban, with the other Death Eaters, awaiting trial. So Severus survived, too. Percy exhales deeply, feeling limp and boneless with the relief, the mystery of Severus, fate one of the remaining areas of tension propping his body into some semblance of attentiveness. Dumbledore's portrait will provide testimony, or Andromeda, or even McGonagall herself. He stirs himself long enough to say, listlessly, "Don't tell him. I'm sorry. Don't tell him about this." Percy flushes under McGonagall's frown and says softly, "Don't mention me at all." "Mr. Weasley." "No," Percy says strongly, his voice echoing through this ward. "You will not speak to him of me. None of you. You owe me this, at least." Myrtle tries to come by his bed, to hover near him, to speak of him of death. He looks away. He does not listen. He has become very adept at not listening, at retreating into the only part of him that still feels like it is his. Even Myrtle's voice flows over him harmlessly when he does this, like the buzz of the magic that used to be omnipresent in his life. He knows he is hurting her. He can see her ghostly tears drip cool recriminations onto his arm, but how can he explain that he has nothing more to say? "I understand what it's like, Percy, to wake up and not have your magic. But you're dead, Myrtle. I couldn't even manage that. You were trying to die. Of course I was trying to die, Myrtle." He mimics her voice nastily. "There's power in a dying wish. Bloody hell, Myrtle." A pause, a shimmer through the air as Myrtle shifts uncomfortably. What were you wishing for?" He does not answer. After several days of this, Percy is moved to Grimmauld Place. Nobody knows where his flat is, except for perhaps Tonks, and he flatly refuses to tell them, so someone, somewhere, makes the decision that Percy would be better off under the Grimmauld Place wards. Most of the Death Eaters have been captured, but not all, and there is a subset of rebels who would probably love to tear Percy to bits with their bare arms. Andromeda brings him to Grimmauld Place, though she leaves shortly after depositing him in the kitchen. Percy finds Andromeda's company the most bearable. After her initial effort to rouse him, she does not try fruitlessly to wake him from his stupor, and she never mentions difficult topics like the others who seem to view it their personal mission to help Percy become content with his new lot in life. If Hermione tells him one more time that there really are amazing Muggle inventions that are almost like magic, he's going to kill her. Percy is unsteady on his feet after laying on his back for so long, and Creature has to assist him in walking up the long, thin stairs. He chooses Regulus' room. He doesn't think the other man would mind, and the tasteful decorations are soothing. Andromeda replaces the bed for him silently, but otherwise leaves the room unchanged. His days in Grimmauld Place follow a set schedule. He wakes up and showers in one old, gritty bathroom without a working mirror, standing in the shower while the pipes groan and creak around him. Creature would clean it for him if he asked, but he has told Creature to stay out of the rooms that he occupies. He walks down 3 flights of stairs, a task that sometimes takes him nearly an hour. Creature prepares him breakfast. He eats it silently. He looks at the moving pictures of the Daily Prophet without reading any of the articles. He sits in the kitchen for several hours, drinking the same cup of tea, while Creature sits at the table opposite him and polishes the old black family silver by hand. He typically skips lunch. Once Creature leaves the table, he goes upstairs and sleeps. Supper is again silent. Percy has a single glass of elf wine. Creature insists on serving it to him, and then he goes back to bed. The solitude suits him. The schedule suits him. Percy keeps his mind carefully, intentionally blank. He does not try to use his magic again. He does not think about Tom. Sometimes Andromeda comes and sits with him silently. Tonks, she explained the first day, finds it too difficult to see Percy. That is fine. He does not want Tonks to see him like this, a half-being, disgusting. Andromeda never saw him as anything other than a means to an end, and now his use has ended. They do not owe each other anything else. He expects she will cease her visits soon. Draco comes once. He shouts at Percy, something about living with scars, brandishing his arm. They were marked together. Though Draco had received the physical mark a year later, that night would stand in both of their minds forever as the night that it had all begun. Likely it will always bind them. Percy does not see that it matters. On a Muggle, the remnants of the dark mark are nothing more than faded ink stains. He is nothing, a man without purpose, without direction, without power. He may as well not have a name. He may as well be dead, and the only thing that he can focus his mind on is thinking how he will get there, once everyone stops watching him, once they realize he has no value anymore. April 1998, by the second month, Percy's plight is forgotten by largely everyone. Each of his siblings make a token effort to connect with him. Charlie and Bill come every week and chat quietly, mostly about Bill's upcoming nuptials, while Percy listens silently, though Ginny and Ron come only once, both clearly uncomfortable in his presence. Fred and George send him loud, zany care packages, which he would admit only under pain of death occasionally make him laugh, offsetting some of the grey dreariness of Grimmauld Place. His parents come only once as well. Percy does not know what they had been told, but they do not move to touch him or ask him questions, merely sitting with him through a cup of tea before leaving him be. Draco, surprisingly, is his most frequent visitor, but Percy dreads his visits the most, since Draco shouts directly at him until Percy is required to fork over a series of short, curt answers until Draco is satisfied. Percy is fairly sure that everyone else thinks that he is dead. He is not invited to anyone's trials, though Draco tells him of their outcome on every visit, nor is he required to be punished for his sins, nor is he celebrated for his dubious role in the proceedings. This last seems to bother Draco the most. "You clearly did something," he says, frustrated more than once. "Tonks says you passed her messages, and you were in the order, and it was enough to clear you. But nobody knows what you did or how you learned of the Horcruxes. I reckon you're a bloody hero, but nobody knows it except for you. Don't you want them to know? They pardoned me, says Percy, when the silence stretches on to the point where he can tell that Draco is close to turning on him angrily. He does not finish the thought that to be officially pardoned is more than he can ask for and plenty of reward. When he does find the best way to pass quietly from this world, at least his parents will not be ashamed of him. I reckon you ought to have an Order of Merlin, Draco says sulkily. Percy had told Draco of his role in Lucius' death, but Draco, demonstrating a maturity far beyond his years, had told Percy that he'd left behind Lucius a token when he'd fled from Malfoy Manor, a token that should have indicated clearly to his father that he'd left of his own accord. If Lucius had felt it necessary to involve himself again with the Dark Lord after Percy and Severus had given him an ironclad excuse to flee the country, or so Draco said, then that was his own fault. You'd be written up in all the history books. Don't you want that? Does he indeed? Percy had dreamt of this moment for so many years, a shining vision in a mirror, his family alive, his actions justified, the apologies and tears and gratitude. But now that it is here, he finds he couldn't care less. The people important to him had not trusted him, or perhaps they had trusted him too much. Percy had loved Tom at the end. He'd loved him, he'd kissed him, he'd offered in the privacy of his soul to help Tom heal. He was a traitor, and he had paid the ultimate price for it. What punishment could they levy that was worse than what he'd received? What reward would not be predicated on falsehood? June 1990, 8 Percy may have carried on in a haze of listlessness for the rest of his life if it weren't for the large picture of Severus Snape behind bars that adorns the Morning Prophet in early June. Snape sentenced to death, the headline says, striking enough to permeate even Percy's practiced stupor. With a jolt, he sits up. His throat is so scratchy from disuse it takes him several tries to clear it. Creature, he croaks finally. What's going on with Severus? Creature looks up in surprise, but he is well-trained or disinterested enough not to comment on Percy's miraculous return to the world of conversation. Master Bat is on trial for his crimes of war, Creature says conversationally. Mistress Black tells you yesterday. Percy thinks back, but he cannot even remember Andromeda visiting him yesterday, let alone her telling him that Severus was on trial. After Percy's explosion at McGonagall, she'd assured him tartly that neither nor Andromeda even spoke his name to Severus, which had made him feel a bit ashamed, but far more relieved. That Severus had not contacted him, though Narcissa had written Draco a letter during her brief stint in Azkaban, had not been particularly surprising. First, Percy doubted Severus had anything to say to him that could be expressed in a letter couried by another person, and second, Percy doubted Severus had anything to say to him at all. Much like Andromeda, his use for Percy would have ended with the conclusion of the war. But sentenced to death, Percy shakes his head. Creature, he can't die. He doesn't deserve to die. Creature shrugs, one ear drooping. Creature thinks it does not matter what Master Bat deserves. No, wait, Creature, no. Percy rubs his eyes with an exhausted hand and realizes that he is growing a beard. Creature, I can't let him die, not like this. What does the dark Weasley child want Creature to do? Creature asks apprehensively. Percy casts around for an idea, but again so many days of inaction, his mind is sluggish and unresponsive. Severus in Azkaban, it feels to him like a story, like something that happened in his previous life, distant and remote. Hogwarts, he says finally. The sound of the world clangs uncomfortably in his stomach. For a second he hesitates. Can he even go to Hogwarts? Could he bear it? Take me to Andromeda, he says instead, flushing angrily as Creature regards him with large, worried eyes. Or bring Andromeda here, anything. Should Creature bring Andromeda here, Percy orders. Just get her, please, Creature. I can't travel. Even the idea of leaving Grimmauld Place is frightening to him. He casts his mind back, but he cannot remember the last time he went outside. Sometimes, when Charlie comes, he flings open all of the blinds and forces the sunlight to filter in through the stained windows. But Charlie has been in Romania for a few weeks now, and so Percy has not even drawn back the heavy black drapes. Some part of his old self stirs as he sits silently at the kitchen table. He is wearing yesterday's clothes, and not even robes at that, only a pair of trousers and a long-sleeved shirt. But Percy pictures himself wearing wizarding robes and grimaces at the embarrassing picture that would present. No, why should he clean himself? His appearance reflects his true self, now that he cannot cast a glamour charm to hide it. To his surprise, when Creature returns with Andromeda, she is not alone. McGonagall follows her into the kitchen, trailed by a sullen Harry. Percy drags his gaze quickly away from Harry. He has not seen him since that awful first day when he first learned. Percy looks instead at Creature, who pulls on his long ears apologetically. Madam Black was not alone, he explains. I was at Hogwarts, actually, Andromeda explains crisply. Saw the paper, did you? Why? Percy begins, before he falls silent. He does not need to know why Andromeda was at Hogwarts. Hogwarts is no longer his concern. McGonagall answers him anyway. She has not visited him either, but Percy can only imagine the veritable mountain of work she must be under. And anyway, he'd figured it would be as painful for her to see her former pupil in his state as it would be for him to see his former mentor. Better for them to leave their relationship in the past. We were trying to figure out the password that Severus used for the headmaster's office. Oh. Percy swallows and then, continuing to avoid Harry's gaze, looks only to Andromeda. Why is he? I mean, you must know he helped. Did he? Harry inquires coolly. Andromeda gives Harry an unimpressed glance. As I have explained before, Mr. Potter, Severus destroyed one of the Horcruxes and helped me to destroy another. She looks to Percy before Harry can muster up an objection. Mr. Potter insists we cannot reveal that the Dark Lord had Horcruxes, and Severus is refusing to testify. Do you have anything we could speak to that doesn't involve Horcruxes? Percy frowns at Harry despite himself. You would condemn him to death, knowing that he aided in the Dark Lord's defeat, merely because you do not wish for anyone to learn about the Horcruxes. Surely you could tell the minister and bind him to a vow. Harry raises a challenging eyebrow. Vows can be broken. Percy flushes angrily and looks at the rough grain of the kitchen table, the admonishment landing like a blow. Mr. Potter, snaps McGonagall, to Percy's surprise. There is no call to be rude. Mr. Weasley, I have suggested the same. My concern is that without knowing Severus' true motives, merely submitting evidence that he aided in the destruction of the Horcruxes would not be sufficient to clear his name. He is on trial for a number of crimes, all very serious. His opponents could easily argue that he was destroying the Horcruxes, or pretending to, in order to wrestle control from Voldemort himself. Percy flinches at the name, which he is sure does not go unnoticed. Crossing his toes inside his shoes, he forces himself to look up. Severus was part of the Order since the previous war. He operated on Dumbledore's orders for over a decade, until he killed Dumbledore. After Harry said as much to the crowds, there was no saving Severus, interjects Andromeda dryly. Harry glowers at her. I wasn't going to let them string up Draco instead. Percy frowns behind his glasses, but Dumbledore asks Severus to kill him. He is surprised to see the shock cross Harry's face. Surely Dumbledore's portrait would have. Oh, of course. They cannot get to Dumbledore's portrait, not without the password to the office. McGonagall and Andromeda's motives suddenly become far clearer to Percy, whose mind is also slowly clearing from its slow, sleepy stasis. He has one more task, one last task, and then he can sleep, or whatever will bring him rest. Lily, he says quietly, and the protest that was midway out of Harry's mouth stalls and drops to the floor. Try Lily, or perhaps Eileen if that does not work. Why? Harry begins weakly. I see, says McGonagall quietly. I should have thought to try that. Harry turns agonized eyes on McGonagall, who regards him soberly. Andromeda is silent. Perhaps she knows the story, or can guess at it, or perhaps it is immaterial to her, as it ought to be for everyone except for Harry. What is it? Harry demands, and McGonagall gives Percy a meaningful look, cool and refreshing from behind her familiar glasses. He closes his eyes to avoid it. He knows what she wants of him, and he does not think he can bear it. Severus was willing to die to not reveal his part of the story, Percy adds, with Andromeda's quiet acceptance in mind. He refused to give testimony, knowing what it meant. He would be ashamed to know we are speaking of it. Speaking of what? Harry insists, his voice rising angrily. His eyes are bright and combative, and he looks angrily between McGonagall and Percy, as if they are playing some sort of elaborate joke on him. Percy opens his mouth to tell Harry to go talk to Dumbledore, now that the office will presumably open for them. But he hesitates. Severus had been willing to die to preserve his secrets, or so he now sees, for Percy cannot imagine another reason for him to refuse to give testimony. Part of Percy wonders if he should honor Severus' final wishes, but a larger part of him thinks stubbornly that he didn't lose his magic just for Severus to kill himself over his embarrassment. And doesn't Percy owe it to Severus to tell this story so that Harry hears it from him and not Dumbledore? Merlin knows what omissions or inclusions Dumbledore will use to twist the truth to his narrative. Percy can at least tell Harry the truth, or something close to it. Severus Snape loved your mother, he says simply, looking again at the table to ground himself. They were childhood friends. I have been to the neighborhood where they both grew up. They maintained a friendship at Hogwarts, but it was difficult for Severus, who was already marked for his Muggle upbringing. His Muggle upbringing. Percy can't help it. He takes a small modicum of pleasure in informing Harry that Severus grew up as a Muggle in the midst of poverty and with a father who treated him poorly, Percy says, coming to his senses at the very end of the sentence. Severus would be furious to know that Percy had revealed even this much. But Harry is silent, as are McGonagall and Andromeda, digesting the information privately. More restrained, Percy continues on. In those days, there were no real options for someone like Severus, so he eventually fell in with a crowd who introduced him to him. He was very kind to Severus, praising his intelligence and power, and personally tutoring him in magic. Percy pauses, and then adds helplessly, at the dawning of rage clouding over Harry, I'm not trying to excuse him, Harry. I'm just trying to explain his motivations. He felt he had no choice. There's always a choice. Only somebody with choices would think that. Percy cannot help but snap back. Or have you felt always you could choose otherwise on this journey? At this, Harry subsides, and Percy hopes that he is finally listening. He takes a deep breath, and suddenly Creature is at his side, offering him a cup of tea. Percy takes it like a rope cast out to him at sea. McGonagall steps in as Percy sips, something like warmth hovering at the edges of her tone, though Percy could not say whether the warmth was meant to be directed at him, Harry, or Severus. Severus Snape was a brilliant student, but he was unpopular, to say the least. Your father and his friends made his life quite difficult. Harry flinches violently at this, and something crosses over his face that changes his expression quite dramatically until he looks more guilty than angry. I've seen a memory. To be brilliant and to be Slytherin was dangerous. Andromeda smiles without humor. I left my family behind, but I had Ted and his family to fall back on. If Severus had been alone, Percy grips the mug of tea tightly and then takes up the reins of the story again. Regardless of his motivations, he joined the Dark Lord after a falling out with Lily. He overheard a prophecy one night and told the Dark Lord what it contained without realizing that it targeted your parents. The minute that he found out, he went straight to Dumbledore and begged him to protect you all. Percy hesitates, but Harry does not seem inclined to interrupt him. As far as I understand it, Dumbledore's first question to him was to ask what he would give to Dumbledore in exchange for your parents' lives. Surely not, snaps McGonagall, unable to contain herself. Percy shrugs. Ask his portrait. Severus swore his fealty to the Order, and then spent the next 17 years looking after you from afar, maintaining his cover as a follower of the Dark Lord. He and Dumbledore suspected the Dark Lord would return. Eventually, Dumbledore learned of the Horcruxes, though he never told Severus his suspicions. He put on the Gaunt family ring, and the Horcrux within him injured him, nearly to death. Given that he was going to die anyway, he asked Severus to do it himself, both to ensure he had a painless death and to solidify Severus' position with the Dark Lord. I examined Albus myself, McGonagall says apologetically to Harry. I do believe that he was dying, though he did not choose to confide in me either, even when I pressed him for details. So what? Demands Harry. He thought that it would be best for Snape to murder him in cold blood. He said, please, Professor. Harry's voice breaks, and Percy flinches away from the raw pain of it. He begged Snape to save his life. Andromeda cuts in softly, or he begged Severus to end it. Percy looks up and catches Harry's eyes. It is not easy to kill Harry. You've all but condemned a man you knew helped you win the war so that you could protect Draco from harm. Severus is his godfather, and Draco was ordered by the Dark Lord himself to kill Dumbledore or have his family be killed for his failings. If Draco had failed, and Severus too, the Dark Lord would have come to kill Dumbledore personally, and it would have been, Percy shivers, gruesome. Harry's face very clearly indicates that he had not fully known of Draco's part in the proceedings, or perhaps he had not considered that Severus had acted out of care of Draco or of Dumbledore. He is young, Percy thinks to himself heavily, and when he meets Andromeda's eyes, she smiles thinly at him in acknowledgement of what they both can see. Harry will need time to digest these events, to understand the complex web of motivations and mercies that bound them all up in the war. Percy is already growing tired of his role in aiding the boy who lived through this final task, but he forces himself to continue, at least to finish his somber retelling of Severus' actions. So Severus killed Dumbledore, and the Dark Lord rewarded him by giving him control of Hogwarts, though he installed the Carrows to watch over him and report on his actions. I'm sure Ginny has quite a lot to say on how the year went, but I'd ask you both to consider that it could have been several degrees worse. In the meantime, he and I collaborated with Andromeda, Tonks, and others to find and destroy the remaining Horcruxes. Severus was the one who stole the Elder Wand from Dumbledore's tomb to pass it to me. He helped us convince Narcissa to retrieve the items from the vault to cure Sirius from the curse, and he nearly died for you, Harry, multiple times. Percy shrugs one shoulder, unable to verbalize the extent of what Severus had done for Harry or for Percy. You do not understand, Harry, the balance we had to maintain. The Dark Lord had to kill you, but we had to ensure he did it at the right time, and without learning that you were a Horcrux. We had to destroy all of the Horcruxes first, so that the Dark Lord would be mortal and vulnerable, and we had to do all of this all while in the Dark Lord's presence. Harry is silent for a prolonged period. Percy takes the opportunity to sip savagely at his cup of tea, wincing as the too-hot liquid slithers its way down his dry, raw throat. He has said more words today than he has since March, and he is incredibly exhausted by the effort that these words have required from him. Soon you can rest. When Harry speaks, his voice is still sharp. Why do you call him the Dark Lord? I'm sorry. The Dark Lord. You don't call him Voldemort. Percy cannot help but snort. To call him V. Voldemort would have resulted in my immediate death, he points out coolly. We did not all have the luxury of bravery. I suppose you want to quote Dumbledore's famous line at me. Fear of the name only increases fear of the thing itself. It's a lovely sentiment, but not particularly practical for some of us. McGonagall frowns at him, and he subsides sheepishly. His emotions feel frayed and rattled, like a miscast. Well, not like anything that Percy has any experience in anymore. Like the end of his cloak, perhaps, frayed and unraveling, too delicate to be stitched back together with a knitting charm. Percy squeezes his toes together tightly and turns his attention back to Harry, who is not finished with him. Part of Percy can still feel the impression of Harry's magic, loose and unchained, as it whips around the room with his volatile emotions. It makes Percy feel nauseated, and he takes another optimistic sip of tea, which is no easier to swallow than the first. You told Tom you loved him. Percy closes his eyes. He has resolutely not thought OFOF Tom of the last day of everything that transpired. His mouth seems to fill with saliva, his throat smarting and burning, and he tastes his blood, hot and metallic, as he bites down on the inside of his lip. Forcing his eyes open, Percy meets Harry's gaze, unwavering and unforgiving. I did, Percy admits shortly. He was important to me, but I did not want the Dark Lord to succeed. While referring to one of the Dark Lord's Horcruxes, clarifies McGonagall, who has clearly been only partially briefed. You loved him, repeats Harry coolly. Maybe Snape loved my mum, but he killed Dumbledore and likely dozens of others. Maybe you helped us destroy Voldemort, but you were a Death Eater too. All of you deserve to die. Something inside Percy snaps, and he finds himself standing before he can. And Yaxley, who lied to the Dark Lord's face for you. Multiple times, I might add. Percy shakes his head angrily. And Narcissa, who risked everything to take us to her vault, helping us to save Sirius and retrieve another Horcrux. You told me that Draco was able to get you back into this house. Had you not considered that Narcissa and Draco could have tried earlier and must have lied to the Dark Lord to make him believe otherwise? What about Lucius, who spent the last minutes of his life trying to save his sons? All of us, Harry. It's funny, that sounds like something Voldemort may say. I did not expect you to lack nuance. You have no idea what I've been through, yells Harry back, his face screwed in an expression of rage. You have no idea what it's like to have him in your head. I had Tom in my head for years. Percy bellows back, in a voice that he does not recognize, the chair screeching beneath him as he stands. I had Tom in my flat, in a portrait on my wall, a portrait that I painted after the diary possessed my younger sister. Tom nearly killed my father and made me watch Harry. I had Tom watching me at work, and reporting everything I did to him, and Tom following me home, and Tom demanding things from me. The Dark Lord chose me to be his sworn companion. Do you know what that means? He trusted me with his life, Tom with his soul. I know every version of Tom better than I know myself, and I loved one of them, and I helped kill them all, do you understand? They trusted me above anyone else, and I killed them all, and I wish I'd killed myself too. He pauses, panting awkwardly, and realizes belatedly that he was waiting for his magic to flare up with his anger. But of course his magic will never spark again. This knowledge takes the wind out of his chest, and he drops back into his seat, exhausted and sorrowful all over again. You painted a portrait of Tom, McGonagall interjects, staring at Percy with narrowed eyes. When you were in your 6th year, Percy shakes his head dispiritedly. After Hogwarts, he mutters. I'm not on trial, am I? Severus is the one that matters here. Harry, I know that he was awful to you, and I'm not defending him for that. He was a shoddy professor, and he was cruel to you. But he saved your life, maybe all of our lives, and he does not deserve to be thanked like this. Give him an order of Merlin, or let him live out the rest of his days alone, if he wants. But don't kill him just because he was mean to you. It is Percy's turn to be admonished by McGonagall for his insulting words. But Percy is suddenly sick of all of them, even Andromeda, watching the events unfold silently. They would have let Severus die, just because the Chosen One was too stubborn to tell the truth of all of the Horcruxes to the Minister of Magic. I've told you what you need to know, Percy says, standing and bowing shortly to Andromeda, and then McGonagall before he realizes mid-bow that he is no longer a pureblood wizard, and therefore no longer allowed to use the old ways. Straightening, he turns away from them to hide the flush in his cheeks. Ask Dumbledore for the rest, once you're in the office. Makes it up 2 flights of stairs before he has to slow, his heart beating. He'd half expected someone to go after him, but after he listens carefully for several minutes, he has to conclude that they've left him alone again to pursue the rest of the truth with Dumbledore. Good. Percy wants to be left alone. You're welcome, Severus, says Percy to the dark, stained wallpaper. He walks the rest of the way to Regulus' room at a more sedate pace, pushing open the door and collapsing onto the bed. On the wall opposite, Tom's familiar face smirks at him, and for the first time in 3 months, Percy props himself up on his elbows and stares at the newspaper clippings. Percy has not allowed himself to think of those final moments. He has not allowed himself to think about the fact that he has lost his magic and is no longer a wizard. He has not allowed himself to think about Tom, or about his soul, or about his vow, or about the kiss that he'd so desperately flung at Tom in an attempt to say goodbye. Percy has not allowed himself to think of any of those moments, because once he starts thinking of them, they all flood in, and the guilt and resentment and sorrow and relief threaten to overwhelm him entirely. Without the aid of his mental library, his memories wobble unsteadily in his mind and nearly collapse in untidy stacks, colliding and merging in an unbearable confluence of conflicting emotions. Percy curls up underneath the blankets, his body shaking, and his face suddenly wet with tears that he does not recall shedding. Oh Merlin, oh Tom, what was he supposed to do now? Not a wizard, not a muggle, barely a squib. Not a war hero, not a Death Eater, barely a member of the Order. To have Harry stare at him with such cool hatred, to tell him he ought to die, to have Severus so close to death, to have McGonagall and Andromeda in the kitchen looking impossibly aged. His parents have only come to see him once. Once. A wave of tears crashes back over Percy as he considers this, though he tries without success to force his mind away. He should not expect anything from his parents. Hadn't he thought to himself that he had barely allowed them to be his parents, that he'd barely asked them of anything, that they barely knew him? Hadn't he nearly killed his father and stubbornly broken his mother's heart, out of pride and anger and resentment? How could he have expected that his parents would have wanted to see him, even if he were still a wizard, after all of his sins had come to light. But he did. This is the weakness that Tom had always seen in him, and he cannot even deny it. He thought perhaps his parents would come, would sit with him quietly as Bill and Charlie do, would tell him that he was still their son, even though he was damaged irrevocably. And Ron and Ginny had only visited him once, and Hermione too, and Fred and George were too busy setting up their shop after Percy had burned down the first one. Tonks found it too difficult to see him. Percy does not blame her. He hasn't looked at himself in the mirror for 3 months. Presumably, Cedric feels the same. Nobody has any use for you, he imagines Tom telling him pityingly, but perhaps without Percy's magic aiding his memories, he can no longer conjure up Tom's voice as accurately as before. Percy remembers entering a muggle's mind with Tonks, the blurred, dim cast to the man's memories. Would that happen to him? Would he cease to remember everything? Maybe it's for the best, Percy mumbles out loud, wiping savagely at his face with one hand. Maybe he'll just forget all of it, his twist through time and those 7 years at Hogwarts, his mission with Severus, the strange, brittle relationship he'd forged with Tom. Maybe it'll all drip away from his mind, drip by tiny drip, until he can sleep without nightmares, without memory, without recognition of what he had lost.